The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone could stop it, and every head in the ballroom turned toward the sound. Alina Whitfield stood frozen, the broken pieces scattered around her feet, her cheeks burning red under the candlelight. She had only reached for a tray to help the servants, trying to make herself useful the way she always did, invisible and quiet at the edge of every gathering. But Margaret Whitfield, her stepmother, saw an opportunity, and she never let one pass. "How clumsy," Margaret said loudly, her voice cutting through the music and laughter. "But then again, what do you expect from a girl no man will ever choose? She cannot even hold a glass steady. Imagine handing her a household." Laughter rippled through the crowd of guests, some polite, some cruel, and Alina felt her chest tighten as if a hand had closed around her throat. She kept her eyes down, staring at the shattered glass rather than the faces around her, because she knew if she looked up, she would see her stepsisters Charlotte and Beatrice smiling behind their fans. This was not new, it had never been new. For 6 years, ever since her father remarried and then passed away 2 winters later, Alina had lived inside this house like a shadow, tolerated but never welcomed, useful but never valued. Margaret controlled everything now, the money, the household, the name that Alina's own mother had once carried with pride. And every chance she got, Margaret reminded Alina of her place. "Pick it up," Margaret said, gesturing toward the broken glass with a flick of her wrist, as though speaking to a servant rather than a stepdaughter, "before someone important sees the mess you have made." Alina knelt down, her silk gloves already ruined from the wine that had spilled across the floor, and began gathering the shards with trembling fingers. She had learned long ago that arguing only made things worse. Silence was armor, silence was survival. What she did not know was that a man standing near the tall windows at the far end of the room had seen the entire scene unfold, and he had not laughed. He was tall, dressed simply compared to the other gentlemen present, his coat a plain dark gray without the gold trim and jeweled buttons that marked most of the men in that ballroom. He carried himself with a quiet stillness, the kind that made him easy to overlook in a crowd obsessed with peacock displays of wealth. Nobody in the room knew his name, nobody had thought to ask. He had arrived late, introduced only briefly by the host as a guest passing through the county, and he had spent most of the evening observing rather than participating. His name was Alexander Ashworth, and he was the Duke of Camden, though not a single soul in that ballroom knew it. He had come to this gathering under a borrowed identity, tired of the endless parade of mothers pushing their daughters toward him the moment his true title became known, tired of conversations that felt like business transactions dressed up as romance. For 3 months he had traveled through the countryside unannounced, staying in modest inns, attending local gatherings as an anonymous gentleman, simply to remember what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a prize. He had not expected to see something like this. He watched as Alina gathered the broken glass alone, no one moving to help her, the guests already turning back to their conversations and their wine as if nothing had happened. Margaret had already walked away, joining a cluster of women near the fireplace, laughing about something else entirely, the cruelty already forgotten by everyone except the girl still kneeling on the floor. Alexander crossed the room before he had fully decided to do it. "Allow me," he said quietly, crouching down beside her and helping to gather the remaining pieces of glass. Alina looked up startled, her eyes wide with surprise rather than gratitude, as though she could not quite process the idea that a stranger would kneel down to help her. "You do not need to trouble yourself," she said softly. "I can manage." "I do not doubt that you can," Alexander replied, placing a shard onto the small pile she had collected. "But I would rather help than watch you do it alone." There was nothing dramatic in his voice, no performance meant for the room to notice, and that was what struck Alina most. He was not doing this to be seen as gallant. He simply seemed to think it was the right thing to do, and he did it without asking permission from anyone. A servant arrived moments later with a small broom, apologizing for the delay, and Alina rose to her feet, brushing off her skirt, unsure of what to say to the stranger who had knelt beside her without hesitation. "Thank you," she said finally. "You should not have to thank someone for common decency," Alexander said, and there was something in his tone, not pity, but a quiet kind of anger directed at the room itself, at the people who had laughed and looked away. Alina did not know what to make of him. Kindness was rare in her life, and unexplained kindness made her cautious rather than comforted. She had learned that people who were nice to her often wanted something, or worse, were only being nice because someone important was watching. "You are new to this house," she said, more of an observation than a question, eager to change the subject away from herself. "I am new to this county," Alexander said. "I am only passing through. My name is Alexander." He did not give a surname, and Alina did not ask for one. In her world, surnames only mattered when they came with titles and fortunes attached, and she had long since stopped caring about either. "Alina," she said simply. Before either of them could say more, Margaret's voice rang out again from across the room, calling for Alina to attend to the guests near the refreshment table, her tone sharp enough that several people glanced over. Alina's shoulders tensed instinctively, the way a person braces before a blow they know is coming. "I should go," she said quietly, and without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward her stepmother's voice, disappearing into the crowd of silk gowns and polished boots. Alexander remained standing near the broken glass a moment longer, watching her go, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. He had met countless women in ballrooms exactly like this one, women trained from childhood to charm him, to flatter him, to angle for his attention the moment his title was mentioned. But Alina had not done any of that. She had not even asked his last name. She had simply thanked him and walked away to serve people who did not deserve her effort. He found himself watching her for the rest of the evening, not obviously, but with the quiet attentiveness of a man who had suddenly become curious about something he could not quite name. He watched as she refilled glasses for guests who barely acknowledged her, as she stood silently behind her stepsisters, while they received compliments on gowns that Alina herself had likely helped alter and stitch, as she endured small, sharp remarks from Margaret every time she passed within reach. Nobody else in the room seemed to notice any of it. To them, Alina was simply part of the furniture of the Whitfield household, expected to serve, expected to stay quiet, expected to disappear into the background of her stepmother's carefully constructed image. But Alexander noticed everything, and the more he watched, the more something inside him hardened into quiet resolve. He was not a man who acted on impulse. As Duke, every decision he made carried weight, consequences that rippled through his estate, his tenants, his family name. He had spent years learning patience, learning to observe before acting, learning that the wrong words in the wrong moment could undo years of careful diplomacy. But something about the sight of that young woman on her knees, gathering broken glass while a room full of people laughed at her expense, settled into his memory in a way he knew he would not easily forget. Later that evening, as the guests began to take their leave and carriages lined up outside the manor, Alexander found himself near the entrance hall where Alina stood, helping guests into their coats and cloaks, her expression composed but her eyes tired in a way that spoke of long practice hiding exhaustion. "You handled that well," he said quietly, stepping beside her while she waited for the next guest to approach. "Handled what?" Alina asked, though they both knew what he meant. "The glass, the comment, all of it." Alexander kept his voice low, meant only for her. "You did not let it break you in front of the room." Alina's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Alexander thought he had overstepped, that he had touched a wound too raw to acknowledge so directly. But then she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "If I let it break me every time, I would have shattered years ago," she said, "so I have learned not to." There was no self-pity in her words, only a plain, unvarnished honesty that struck Alexander harder than any calculated speech could have. He had spent years surrounded by people who curated every word they spoke to him, who softened truths or exaggerated praise depending on what they hoped to gain. Alina spoke to him as though he were simply another guest passing through her evening, someone whose opinion of her carried no particular weight, and that, more than anything, made him want to know more about her. "Do you enjoy these gatherings?" he asked. Alina almost laughed, though the sound that escaped her was closer to a tired breath than genuine amusement. "I attend them. That is different from enjoying them." "Then why attend at all?" "Because my stepmother requires an extra pair of hands, and because refusing would cost me more than simply enduring does," Alina said. She glanced toward him then, studying his face properly for the first time that evening, as though trying to understand why a stranger would care enough to ask such questions. "You ask a great many questions for someone I have known less than an hour." "I find I am curious about people who refuse to let cruelty win," Alexander said simply. Before Alina could respond, Margaret's voice called out again, sharp and impatient, summoning her toward the departing carriage of an important local family, and Alina excused herself with a brief nod, disappearing once more into the demands of her household. Alexander watched her go, standing quietly near the entrance hall long after most of the guests had departed, turning over the events of the evening in his mind. He thought of the countless balls he had attended in the city, filled with women who knew exactly who he was and shaped every word and gesture around that knowledge. He thought of how easily those interactions blurred together, indistinguishable from one another, empty performances repeated endlessly. And then he thought of Alina, kneeling on the floor gathering broken glass, refusing to let a room full of laughter break her composure, speaking to him with a plain honesty that owed nothing to his unknown title. He did not know, standing there in that quiet entrance hall, that this single evening would change the course of both their lives. He only knew that he was not ready to simply walk away and forget the girl her own stepmother had so casually humiliated in front of an entire room. As his carriage finally pulled away from the Whitfield estate that night, Alexander glanced back once at the lit windows of the house, wondering when he might find a reason to return, and knowing, somewhere beneath the careful discipline of a man trained never to act rashly, that he already intended to. Inside the house, Alina climbed the narrow staircase to her small room at the back of the manor, far from the grand chambers occupied by Margaret and her daughters. She sat on the edge of her bed, pulling off her ruined gloves, replaying the strange encounter with the stranger who had knelt beside her without being asked. She told herself it meant nothing. Kind words from a passing stranger changed nothing about her circumstances, changed nothing about the years stretching ahead of her under Margaret's control. But as she blew out her candle and lay in the darkness, she found herself thinking of his voice, steady and unbothered by the opinions of the room, and wondering, despite every instinct telling her not to hope for anything at all, whether she might see him again. Neither of them could have known that night how far that hope would carry them, or how much would have to be endured before it could be answered. 3 days after the ball, Alina stood in the small kitchen garden behind the manor, cutting herbs for the evening meal, when the sound of hooves on the gravel path made her look up. She expected a delivery cart, or perhaps a messenger for Margaret, but instead she saw a single rider approaching slowly, his horse moving at an easy pace along the winding drive. She recognized him before he was close enough for his face to be clear. Something about the way he sat, unhurried and composed, told her it was the stranger from the ballroom. Alexander dismounted near the low garden wall and tied his horse to a nearby post, glancing around the modest grounds with an expression that gave nothing away. Alina set down her basket of herbs and wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of how she must look, dressed plainly for garden work rather than for company. "You did not tell me you would call," she said, though there was no real accusation in her voice, only surprise. "I did not know myself until this morning," Alexander admitted. "I was riding through the county and found myself near your gate. I hoped I might not be intruding." Alina glanced back toward the house, half expecting Margaret to appear at a window and demand an explanation for the visitor, but the house remained quiet, its curtains still. Margaret had taken the carriage into town that morning with Charlotte and Beatrice, chasing invitations to a card party hosted by a family with connections to minor nobility, leaving Alina behind to manage the household duties as always. "You are not intruding," Alina said finally. "Though I confess I do not have much to offer a guest, I am only cutting herbs." "Then I will help you cut herbs," Alexander said, as though this were the most natural offer in the world. Alina almost laughed at the image of a well-dressed gentleman kneeling in dirt beside rows of rosemary and thyme, but something in his expression told her he was entirely serious. She handed him a small knife without further protest, and for the next half hour they worked side by side in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by simple conversation. "Tell me about your family," Alexander said eventually, cutting a sprig of mint with more care than necessary, as though the task required his full attention rather than the conversation. Alina hesitated. It was not a question she was often asked, and certainly not one she was accustomed to answering honestly. Most people who inquired about her family already knew the gossip, the whispered stories about the poor stepdaughter living off her stepmother's charity, and asked only to hear her confirm it. "My mother died when I was 12, she said slowly. "My father remarried 2 years later. Margaret already had 2 daughters from her first marriage, Charlotte and Beatrice. My father passed when I was 16, and since then this has been Margaret's house in every way that matters." "And your father's estate, his fortune?" "There was little fortune to speak of by the time he passed," Alina said. a note of old bitterness creeping into her voice despite her efforts to keep it steady. What remained went toward maintaining appearances Margaret felt were necessary: new gowns for my stepsisters, invitations to gatherings meant to secure them good marriages. I'm not part of those plans. Why not? Alina looked up at him then, studying his face as though trying to determine whether the question was genuine curiosity or simple politeness. Because Margaret has decided I am not worth the investment, she said plainly. A plain girl with no fortune of her own is not a good use of limited resources, not when there are two daughters with better prospects to consider. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest at the matter-of-fact way she spoke about her own worth being calculated and dismissed, as though she had long since accepted the verdict without protest. He wanted to argue, to tell her that any assessment of her value that excluded her intelligence, her resilience, her quiet strength was a foolish and short-sighted one. But he sensed that offering easy compliments to a woman so unaccustomed to receiving them honestly would only make her suspicious of his intentions. "You do not seem plain to me," he said instead, simply, without exaggeration. Alina's cheeks colored slightly, and she busied herself with the herbs to avoid meeting his eyes. "You hardly know me," she said. "I know enough to disagree with your stepmother's assessment," Alexander replied. They continued working, the conversation drifting to easier topics, the books Alina had managed to read despite limited access to her father's old library, the small pleasures she found in tending the garden, away from the constant demands of the household. Alexander found himself asking question after question, genuinely fascinated by the way she spoke about ordinary things with such careful thought, as though she had spent years observing the world closely because there was little else available to occupy her attention. In turn, Alina found herself curious about him as well, though she was careful not to press too directly into questions about his background or his family, sensing an unspoken boundary in the way he answered certain questions vaguely, mentioning an estate without naming it, a family without detailing its history. "You are careful with your answers," she observed at one point, not accusingly, simply noting it aloud. Alexander paused, glancing at her with something like respect for her observation. "I suppose I am," he admitted. "There are certain expectations attached to my family name that I find tiresome. When I travel, I prefer people to know me before they know my circumstances." "That seems a reasonable preference," Alina said, though a small part of her wondered what kind of circumstances required such careful management. She did not press further, sensing that whatever he was avoiding was not hers to demand, especially from a man she had known for less than a week. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of an approaching carriage on the gravel drive announced Margaret's return, and Alina's posture immediately stiffened, years of instinct taking over before conscious thought could catch up. "You should go," she said quickly, gathering the cut herbs into her basket. "My stepmother will not be pleased to find a gentleman caller she did not arrange herself." Alexander rose from where he had been kneeling in the garden dirt, brushing off his trousers, his expression calm despite the urgency in Alina's voice. "Are you ashamed of my visit?" "I am protecting you from an uncomfortable conversation," Alina said, though the truth was more complicated than that. She did not want Margaret to discover this small, unexpected friendship and find some way to twist it into another opportunity for humiliation, another tool to use against her. Alexander untied his horse from the garden wall as the carriage drew closer, its wheels crunching against gravel. "Then I will go," he said, mounting quickly. "But I would like to call again, if you will permit it." Alina hesitated only a moment before nodding. "You may call again," she said, "though I cannot promise Margaret will make it easy." "I have never particularly cared for easy," Alexander said, and with that he turned his horse and rode away from the manor just as Margaret's carriage rounded the final bend of the drive, the two paths crossing without ever quite meeting. Margaret stepped down from the carriage, her sharp eyes immediately catching sight of the retreating rider in the distance. "Who was that?" she demanded, her tone already suspicious. "A traveler who lost his way and asked for directions," Alina said, the lie coming easily, practiced from years of protecting small pieces of her life from Margaret's interference. "He has already gone." Margaret studied her stepdaughter for a long moment, searching for some crack in the story, but Alina's expression remained carefully composed. betraying nothing of the strange warmth still lingering in her chest from the afternoon spent in quiet conversation among the herbs. "See that you finish your chores before supper," Margaret said finally, apparently satisfied, and swept past Elena into the house, Charlotte and Beatrice trailing behind her, already chattering about the card party and the eligible young men they had met. Elena watched them disappear into the house before allowing herself a small, private smile, one she quickly smoothed away before anyone could notice. She did not know when Alexander would return, or what any of this meant for her future, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself looking forward to something beyond simple survival. Over the following 2 weeks, Alexander found reasons to call at the Whitfield estate whenever Margaret and her daughters were occupied elsewhere, timing his visits carefully, learning the rhythms of the household through careful observation and occasional questions to Elena herself. Sometimes their meetings lasted only a few stolen minutes near the garden wall. Other times, when Margaret took the girls into town for extended shopping excursions, Alexander and Elena walked the grounds for hours, talking about everything and nothing, the conversation never once growing dull or forced. Elena found herself changing in small, quiet ways during those weeks. She stood a little straighter. She allowed herself to laugh more freely when something genuinely amused her, rather than suppressing the sound out of habit. She began cautiously to believe that perhaps her stepmother's cruel judgment in that crowded ballroom was not the final word on her worth, not if a man like Alexander could see something in her that Margaret had spent years insisting did not exist. But even as the friendship deepened, a quiet unease lingered beneath Elena's growing happiness. She still knew almost nothing concrete about Alexander's family, his estate, his true circumstances beyond his own careful and deliberately vague descriptions. And though she told herself it did not matter, that she cared for the man before her rather than his fortune or his name, a small voice in the back of her mind wondered what she would find if she ever learned the full truth of who he really was. She did not have to wait much longer to find out, though the manner in which the truth arrived would test everything she had begun to believe about trust, about honesty, and about whether kindness offered by a stranger could survive contact with the full weight of his real life. The carriage wheel snapped somewhere along the narrow road that wound through Camden Woods, throwing Elena forward against the worn cushioned seat before the vehicle lurched to a stuttering halt. She heard the driver curse under his breath and climbed down to inspect the damage, and through the small window she could see the wheel had cracked clean through, splinters of wood scattered across the muddy road. She had been sent into the neighboring town that morning to collect fabric for Charlotte's upcoming engagement gown, a task Margaret considered too tedious for herself or her precious daughters, but perfectly suitable for Elena. Now, stranded on an isolated stretch of road as the afternoon light began to fade, Elena felt the familiar tightening of anxiety in her chest. "How far to the nearest village?" she asked, stepping down from the carriage to survey the damage herself. 3 miles at least, miss," the driver said, scratching his head as he examined the broken wheel. "I will need to walk for help. It may take some time." Elena nodded, understanding there was little else to be done. She settled onto a fallen log near the roadside, pulling her shawl tighter against the cooling evening air, and prepared herself for a long, uncomfortable wait. The driver set off toward the village, leaving her alone with the carriage and the deepening shadows of the surrounding woods. She had not been waiting more than 20 minutes when the sound of approaching hooves reached her ears, faster and more urgent than the leisurely pace she had grown accustomed to during Alexander's usual visits. She stood, brushing off her skirt, and watched as a rider came into view around the bend, slowing his horse the moment he spotted the broken carriage. It was Alexander, though something about his expression, the sharp alertness in his eyes as he took in the scene, told her this encounter was different from their usual quiet meetings among the garden herbs. "Elena," he said, dismounting quickly, "are you injured?" "I am fine," she assured him, though she could not deny the relief that flooded through her at the sight of a familiar face. "The wheel broke. My driver has gone for help." Alexander examined the damaged wheel briefly before turning back to her, his expression easing slightly now that he understood the situation was one of inconvenience rather than danger. "You should not wait here alone in the dark," he said. "Allow me to escort you somewhere safer while your driver arranges repairs." Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting his offered hand, allowing him to help her onto his horse before he swung up behind her, taking the reins with practiced ease. They rode in comfortable silence for a short distance before Alexander guided the horse off the main road, following a smaller path that wound through the trees toward what Alina assumed must be some modest lodge or cottage where they could wait out the evening. What emerged from the trees instead made her breath catch in her throat. Beyond the final line of oak trees stood a house unlike anything Alina had ever seen up close, its stone facade stretching wide across manicured grounds, tall windows glowing with candlelight, a fountain at its center throwing silver droplets into the darkening sky. Servants moved along the pathways, some bowing slightly as Alexander's horse approached, addressing him with a title that made Alina's entire body go still. "Your Grace," one of the servants said, hurrying forward to take the horse's reins. "We did not expect you this evening." Alina sat frozen behind Alexander, her hands still resting where they had gripped his coat during the ride, her mind struggling to reconcile the simple, unassuming man she had come to know over the past weeks with the grandeur unfolding before her eyes. "Your Grace," she repeated slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. "Alexander, what is this place?" He turned slightly in the saddle, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw genuine discomfort cross his features, the careful composure he usually maintained slipping just enough to reveal something closer to guilt. "This is my home," he said quietly. "I am Alexander Ashworth, Duke of Camden." The words settled over Alina like a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She slid down from the horse without waiting for his assistance, needing distance, needing space to process the enormity of what he had just revealed. A duke, not a traveling gentleman of modest means, not a curious stranger passing through the county, but one of the most powerful men in the entire region, someone whose name alone commanded the kind of respect and fear that shaped entire communities. "Why did you not tell me?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended, though the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. Alexander dismounted as well, handing the reins to a waiting servant before approaching her carefully, as though she were a startled animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "I did not tell anyone during my travels," he said. "I have spent months moving through the countryside without revealing my title, precisely because I wanted to be seen as myself rather than as a prize to be won." "That is not the same as lying to me for weeks," Alina said, and though she kept her voice steady, betrayal simmered beneath every word. "I told you things about my family, about my circumstances, believing I was speaking with an equal. Instead, I was speaking with a duke who found it amusing to observe a poor stepdaughter without ever correcting her assumptions." "It was never amusement," Alexander said firmly, taking a step closer. "Alina, I withheld my title because the moment people learn who I am, everything changes. Conversations become performances. Every kindness becomes suspect, every smile calculated for advantage. You spoke to me honestly because you did not know what I could offer you, and that honesty became the most valuable thing anyone had given me in years." Alina wanted to believe him. Some part of her, the part that remembered every genuine laugh they had shared, every quiet conversation among the garden herbs, wanted desperately to accept his explanation and move past the shock of this revelation. But another part of her, hardened by years of Margaret's manipulations and cruelties, warned her to be cautious, to remember that powerful men often justified their deceptions with pretty words, while the consequences fell entirely on those with less power to protect themselves. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now that I know the truth, what is expected of me?" "Nothing is expected of you," Alexander said. "I did not bring you here to trap you into anything, Alina. Your carriage broke, and I offered the nearest safe shelter I could provide. That is all this evening needs to be, unless you wish it to be more." A servant approached quietly, informing them that a message had already been sent to arrange proper repairs for the broken carriage, and that a room had been prepared for Alina to rest and take refreshment while she waited. Alina accepted the offer with a small nod, though her mind remained a tangled storm of confusion and hurt as she followed the servant into the grand entrance hall of Camden Estate. Alexander did not press her further that evening, giving her space to process the revelation in peace, though he remained nearby, checking on her comfort through the servants rather than intruding directly. It was only as the evening wore on, and Alina sat alone in an elegantly furnished sitting room picking at a plate of food she had little appetite for, that she allowed herself to truly consider everything she had learned. A duke, the man who had knelt beside her to gather broken glass, who had cut herbs in her modest garden, who had asked about her family with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation, was one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the entire country. The realization brought with it a complicated tangle of emotions she struggled to untangle. There was hurt, certainly, at having been deceived, even if the deception had not been rooted in cruelty. There was fear, too, a quiet worry that whatever connection had grown between them over these past weeks might have been built on unequal footing from the very beginning, with him fully aware of the power imbalance while she remained ignorant of it. But beneath the hurt and the fear, something else lingered as well, something Alina was reluctant to fully acknowledge. Despite everything, despite the shock of discovering his true identity, the man she had come to know through weeks of quiet conversation had not changed. He still asked thoughtful questions. He still listened when she spoke rather than waiting for his turn to talk. He still treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with her fortune or her family name. Respect that, if anything, made even more sense now that she understood he had experienced firsthand how differently people treated him once they knew his title. Alexander appeared in the doorway sometime later, his expression cautious, clearly uncertain of his welcome. "May I join you?" he asked. Alina gestured toward the chair across from her, and he sat, the silence between them heavy but not entirely uncomfortable, the kind of silence that comes after difficult truths have been spoken and both parties are searching for solid footing to continue. "I am not angry that you are a duke," Alina said finally, breaking the quiet. "I am angry that you let me believe you were something else while I told you things I have never told another living soul. That is not the same as simple caution about revealing your title to strangers." "You are right," Alexander said, and the sincerity in his voice softened some of the hardness that had settled around Alina's heart since the revelation. "I should have told you sooner, once I understood how much I valued our conversations. I let my own comfort in remaining anonymous outweigh what was fair to you, and for that I am sorry." Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing the apology against the weeks of careful omission that had preceded it. She thought of Margaret's cruel words in the crowded ballroom, of the years spent believing herself unworthy of genuine affection or respect, and she thought of how differently Alexander had always treated her, long before either of them understood the full weight of what stood between them now. "I need time," she said finally. "This changes things, Alexander, whether either of us wishes it to or not. A duke and a penniless stepdaughter are not equals in the eyes of the world, whatever equality we found in quiet conversations by a garden wall." "The world's opinion has never particularly interested me," Alexander said quietly. "But I understand that you need time, and I will not press you for more than you are willing to give." The carriage repairs were completed before midnight, and Alina returned home under the cover of darkness, her mind still turning over everything that had happened, the grand estate, the servants bowing to a man she had thought she understood completely, the careful apology that had done little to fully ease the ache of discovering how much had been left unsaid. Margaret was waiting when she arrived, furious over the delay and demanding explanations for the late hour, but Alina found she had little energy left to fear her stepmother's anger that night. Her mind was too full of Duke Alexander Ashworth, of the strange, impossible turn her quiet, overlooked life had suddenly taken, and of the uncertain road that now stretched ahead of her, no longer simple, no longer easily navigated by the careful silence that had protected her for so many years. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the shadows on her ceiling, wondering whether the growing feelings she could no longer deny were worth the risk of everything that now stood between them. The title, the wealth, the world's rigid expectations, and her own stepmother's cruel certainty that no man, let alone a duke, would ever truly choose her. A full week passed before Alina allowed herself to see Alexander again, and during those 7 days, she turned the entire situation over in her mind more times than she could count. She thought of every conversation they had shared, searching for signs she might have missed, moments where his careful omissions should have alerted her sooner to the truth of his identity. She found none. If anything, the more she examined their weeks together, the more she recognized how carefully he had avoided outright deception, choosing vague answers over outright lies, protecting his privacy without ever directly betraying her trust. It did not erase the hurt entirely, but it softened it enough that when Alexander sent a carefully worded note requesting permission to call, asking nothing more than the chance to continue their friendship honestly this time, Alina found herself unable to refuse. He arrived on a quiet afternoon when Margaret had taken the girls to visit a distant relative, leaving Alina with a rare stretch of unsupervised time. This time he arrived not on horseback dressed simply as before, but in a modest carriage bearing no obvious crest, still careful, still respectful of her need for discretion, though there was no longer any pretense about who he truly was. "I brought something," he said as she met him near the garden gate, holding out a small leather-bound book. "I remembered you mentioned your father's library was limited. This collection of poetry belonged to my mother. I thought you might enjoy it." Elena accepted the book carefully, running her fingers over its worn cover, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture despite the lingering uncertainty still coloring her feelings toward him. "Thank you," she said. "Though I hope you understand, gifts alone cannot undo the strangeness of learning who you really are." "I did not bring it to undo anything," Alexander said. "I brought it because I thought of you when I found it, the same reason I have thought of little else these past 7 days." They walked the garden paths together as they had during previous visits, though the conversation carried a new weight now, both of them more careful, more deliberate in their words, aware that the easy anonymity that had once allowed such open honesty was gone, replaced by the full complicated reality of his position and everything it meant for any possible future between them. "Tell me honestly," Elena said as they paused near the low stone wall separating the garden from the surrounding fields. "What did you hope would happen, keeping your identity hidden for so long? Surely you understood that eventually the truth would need to come out." Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "I did not have a plan when I first began speaking with you," he admitted. "I only knew that I did not want our conversations to be shaped by the weight of my title before I had the chance to know you as simply Elena, and to be known by you as simply Alexander. I suppose, if I am honest, I was afraid that once you knew, everything would change. That you would begin speaking to me the way everyone else does, careful, calculated, always aware of what my favor might grant them." "Do you truly believe I am so easily changed by wealth and title?" Elena asked, a note of hurt creeping into her voice. "No," Alexander said quickly. "I do not believe that of you, not truly. But fear does not always listen to reason, and I confess I let my fear guide my choices longer than it should have." Elena accepted this explanation with a slow nod, understanding, even if she did not entirely forgive, the impulse behind his caution. She too understood what it meant to build walls around oneself after years of learning that honesty and vulnerability often invited only further cruelty. Perhaps, she thought, they were not so different after all, two people who had learned to guard themselves carefully against a world quick to exploit any weakness shown. As the weeks that followed unfolded, their friendship gradually rebuilt itself on steadier ground, this time with full honesty between them. Alexander told her more about his responsibilities as Duke, the weight of managing vast estates and tenant welfare, the political pressures from other noble families eager to secure alliances through marriage, the loneliness that came from never quite knowing whether affection offered to him was genuine or merely strategic. In turn, Elena found herself opening up more fully than she had with anyone since her mother's death, sharing memories of happier days before Margaret's arrival, the quiet grief she still carried for her father, the small dreams she had long ago buried beneath the daily grind of survival within a household that valued her only for her usefulness. Their meetings became more frequent, though always carefully arranged to avoid Margaret's notice, and Elena found herself living 2 separate lives, the exhausted, overlooked stepdaughter within the walls of the Whitfield household, and the woman who felt increasingly like herself during stolen hours spent in Alexander's company. Whether walking the grounds of his estate or sharing quiet conversation in the garden she had once thought of as her only refuge. It was during one such afternoon, several weeks after the revelation of his title, that Alexander finally voiced what had been building quietly between them for some time. "I find myself thinking of you constantly," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. "Not simply as a pleasant companion during my travels through this county, but as someone whose absence I feel keenly whenever we are apart. I do not say this lightly, Elena, nor do I say it without understanding the complications it introduces into both our lives." Elena's heart raced at his words, though old fears immediately rose to temper any joy she might have allowed herself to feel. "Complications," she repeated softly. "You mean the difference in our stations, the expectations placed upon a man of your position?" "I mean all of that, yes," Alexander admitted. "My family will have opinions, society will have opinions. There are families who have spent years positioning their daughters as suitable matches for a duke, and they will not welcome the sudden appearance of a stepdaughter with no fortune and no title standing in their way." Then perhaps this is a foolish path to consider at all, Alina said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, betraying none of the genuine feeling that had grown within her over these past weeks. Perhaps, Alexander agreed, or perhaps foolishness is simply the price worth paying for something real, rather than settling for the calculated alliances my position usually demands. He reached for her hand then, gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. I am not asking you to decide anything today, Alina. I am only telling you the truth of what I feel, because you deserve honesty from me, especially after the way our friendship began. Alina looked down at their joined hands, considering the enormity of what he was suggesting, however carefully worded. A future with him would mean facing scrutiny she could barely imagine, scrutiny from his family, from society, and most immediately from her own stepmother, who would surely find some way to interfere the moment she learned the truth. I need to think, Alina said finally, though she did not pull her hand away. This is not a small thing you are asking me to consider. Take whatever time you need, Alexander said. I have already waited this long to speak honestly with you. I can wait a little longer for your answer. The world, as it so often does, had little patience for careful deliberation. Word of Alexander's frequent visits to the Whitfield estate, however discreetly arranged, had begun to spread through the county's tightly woven network of gossip, whispered between servants, mentioned in passing at social gatherings, growing more distorted with each retelling. It was only a matter of time before Margaret heard a version of the rumors that would send her into a fury Alina was entirely unprepared to face. The confrontation came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, when Margaret returned from a visit to a neighboring estate with an expression Alina had learned to recognize as dangerous, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes sharp with barely contained anger. Is it true, Margaret demanded the moment Alina entered the drawing room, that you have been receiving a gentleman caller without my knowledge or permission? Alina's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, years of practice steadying her voice despite the sudden fear coiling through her chest. I do not know what you have heard, she said carefully, but I would ask you to tell me directly rather than relying on second-hand rumor. Mrs. Hartley tells me, Margaret said, her voice rising with each word, that a gentleman has been seen calling at this house on multiple occasions when I have been away, and that this gentleman is none other than the Duke of Camden himself. Tell me this is some absurd exaggeration, Alina, because I cannot fathom why a man of his standing would waste his time on you. The cruelty of the words no longer surprised Alina, though they still stung with familiar sharpness. She considered lying, denying everything, protecting the fragile privacy of her growing connection with Alexander for just a little longer. But something in her had shifted over these past weeks, some quiet strength that had grown alongside her feelings for him, and she found she no longer had the patience to shrink herself smaller for Margaret's comfort. It is not an exaggeration, Alina said steadily. Alexander has been calling on me, and I have been glad of his company. The silence that followed felt like the moment before a storm breaks, thick with tension, and Alina braced herself for whatever fury Margaret would unleash next, understanding that this confrontation, however uncomfortable, marked the beginning of a battle that would test everything she and Alexander had begun to build together. Margaret did not shout, though Alina had half expected her to. Instead, her stepmother's anger settled into something colder and far more calculating, a shift that Alina recognized as more dangerous than any outburst could have been. Margaret sat slowly in her favorite chair near the window, folding her hands in her lap, studying Alina with narrowed eyes as though reassessing an opponent she had previously underestimated. A duke, Margaret said quietly, testing the word as though tasting something unfamiliar. You expect me to believe that Duke Alexander Ashworth, one of the wealthiest and most sought-after men in the entire country, has taken a genuine interest in you. Believe what you wish, Alina said, though her voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. It changes nothing about the truth. Margaret rose from her chair and crossed the room slowly, circling Alina the way a predator might circle prey, considering angles of attack. You understand, of course, that this cannot continue, she said finally. A man of his position requires a wife who can bring connections, wealth, social standing to complement his own. What could you possibly offer him beyond a temporary distraction during his travels through our county? The words were designed to wound, and despite Alina's growing confidence over recent weeks, she felt the familiar sting of doubt creeping back into her chest. She thought of Alexander's family, of the pressures he had described, the noble families eager to secure alliances through marriage. Margaret's cruel assessment was not entirely without merit, however painful it was to acknowledge. "That is between Alexander and myself to determine," Elinor said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "Is it?" Margaret asked, a thin smile spreading across her face. "I think not, Elinor. As your guardian, I have every right to involve myself in matters that affect this family's reputation. And I assure you, I have no intention of standing by while you make a spectacle of yourself chasing after a man so far above your station that the entire county will laugh at your foolishness the moment his family learns of this ridiculous infatuation." Elinor said nothing further, understanding that continuing the argument would accomplish little beyond giving Margaret further ammunition to use against her. She excused herself from the drawing room and retreated to her small bedroom, her mind racing with worry over what Margaret might do next. She did not have to wait long to find out. Over the following days, Margaret's strategy revealed itself gradually, each move calculated to undermine Elinor's growing relationship with Alexander, while simultaneously positioning her own daughters more prominently in his path. Margaret began arranging elaborate social gatherings, insisting on inviting Alexander directly under the guise of neighborly hospitality, while ensuring that Charlotte, in particular, was always dressed in her finest gowns and positioned prominently whenever the Duke might be present. Elinor watched this campaign unfold with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. She could hardly forbid Margaret from hosting gatherings within her own household, and refusing to attend would only draw further suspicion and anger. Instead, she endured evening after evening watching her stepmother maneuver Charlotte into conversations with Alexander, laughing a little too loudly at his every comment, praising his estate and his accomplishments with transparent flattery that made Elinor's stomach turn. To his credit, Alexander remained polite but distant with Charlotte, his attention returning again and again to Elinor whenever circumstances allowed, a small comfort amid the growing tension of Margaret's obvious scheming. But Margaret was not a woman easily discouraged, and when direct social maneuvering failed to produce the results she desired, she turned to more subtle and far more dangerous tactics. It began with small comments dropped carefully into conversations at social gatherings throughout the county, comments about Elinor's supposed history of exaggeration and dishonesty, planted seeds designed to grow into doubt about her character. Margaret was careful never to make direct accusations that could be traced back to her, instead framing her remarks as concerned observations from a worried stepmother. "Elinor has always had a rather active imagination," Margaret would say with a sorrowful sigh to any listening ear. "I do worry sometimes that she embellishes her circumstances to seem more interesting than she truly is. It is a difficult trait to correct in a girl who has always struggled to secure genuine attention." The rumors spread slowly at first, then with increasing speed through the tightly connected social circles of the county, until Elinor began noticing subtle changes in how people treated her at gatherings, sidelong glances, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached, a growing wariness that she recognized as the fruit of Margaret's careful campaign. She confronted her stepmother directly one evening, finding her alone in the study reviewing household accounts. "I know what you are doing," Elinor said, closing the door behind her to ensure privacy. "The rumors, the whispers about my character. This is your doing, is it not?" Margaret did not bother denying it, setting down her pen with an air of calm satisfaction that infuriated Elinor more than any outright confrontation could have. "I am simply protecting this family's reputation," Margaret said. "If the Duke chooses to end his association with you once he hears certain concerns about your character, then perhaps that association was never as strong as you believed it to be. You would destroy my reputation simply to secure a better match for Charlotte," Elinor said, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. "I would do what any responsible guardian would do to ensure the best possible future for her family," Margaret replied coldly. "You have always been an unfortunate complication in this household, Elinor, tolerated out of obligation rather than genuine affection. Do not mistake my patience with you for anything resembling warmth." The cruelty of the admission, spoken so plainly after years of subtler mistreatment, struck Elinor harder than she expected. She had always known on some level that Margaret felt no genuine affection for her, but hearing it stated so directly, so coldly, confirmed every fear she had carried since childhood about her own worth within this household. She left the study without another word, retreating to her room where she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to weep freely, the accumulated weight of years of quiet mistreatment finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained for so long. The rumors continued spreading despite Eleanor's growing distress, and within a fortnight, they reached Alexander himself, delivered through a concerned associate who felt obligated to warn the Duke about the character of the woman he had been so publicly courting. Alexander arrived at the Whitfield estate the following morning, his expression grave, and Eleanor's heart sank the moment she saw him, certain that Margaret's campaign had finally accomplished its intended purpose. "I have heard troubling things," Alexander said without preamble once they were alone in the garden, away from prying ears within the house. "Rumors suggesting you have a history of dishonesty, of exaggerating circumstances to gain sympathy and attention." Eleanor's chest tightened with a familiar, exhausted despair. "And do you believe these rumors?" she asked quietly. "I want to hear the truth from you directly," Alexander said, "before I decide what to believe about anything." "The truth," Eleanor said, her voice hardening with something between grief and resolve, "is that my stepmother has spent the past fortnight spreading these rumors deliberately, hoping to end our association so that her own daughter might have a clearer path to your attention. I have never exaggerated my circumstances, Alexander. If anything, I have spent years minimizing the difficulty of my situation rather than seeking sympathy for it." Alexander studied her carefully, searching her face for any sign of deception, though what he found instead was the same steady, unflinching honesty that had drawn him to her from their very first conversation months earlier. "I believed as much," he said finally, relief evident in his voice. "I only needed to hear it directly from you, rather than relying on second-hand rumor to shape my judgment." "You believed me so easily?" Eleanor asked, surprised despite the relief flooding through her. "I have known you for months now," Alexander said. "I have watched you endure cruelty with dignity, watched you speak honestly even when honesty served you poorly, watched you extend kindness to others despite receiving so little of it yourself. Your character is not so easily disguised by a few whispered rumors from a woman with obvious motive to see our connection ended." Relief washed over Eleanor, though it was quickly followed by renewed frustration at Margaret's continued interference. "She will not stop," Eleanor warned him. "Now that this attempt has failed, she will find other ways to undermine us. I fear what lengths she might go to next." "Then perhaps it is time we stopped allowing her schemes to dictate the terms of our association," Alexander said, a new determination hardening his expression. "I have been patient, Eleanor, respecting your need for time and careful consideration before taking any public steps forward. But I find myself unwilling to allow your stepmother's cruelty to continue unchecked, especially when it threatens to poison something I have come to value deeply." "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor asked, though something in his tone already hinted at the answer. "I am suggesting that it is time for the truth of my intentions toward you to become known publicly," Alexander said. "Not to protect my own reputation, but to protect yours from further damage at your stepmother's hands. If society understands clearly that I have chosen to court you honestly and seriously, her rumors will lose whatever power they currently hold." Eleanor considered his words carefully, understanding the enormity of what he was proposing. A public acknowledgement of his intentions would end any ambiguity about their relationship, but it would also invite intense scrutiny from every corner of society, scrutiny she had witnessed firsthand affect Alexander during their conversations about his position and the pressures that came with it. "Are you certain this is what you want?" she asked. "Once this becomes public, there will be no retreating from it. Your family will have opinions, society will have opinions. And Margaret will not simply accept defeat quietly." "I am certain," Alexander said, taking her hand gently. "I have spent years navigating relationships shaped entirely by calculation and strategy, Eleanor. I have no interest in continuing to hide something genuine simply to avoid the discomfort of public attention. If you are willing to face what comes next together, then I am ready to make my intentions known." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, weighing the fear of public scrutiny against the exhaustion of continuing to hide, of continuing to allow Margaret's cruelty to shape the boundaries of her happiness. She thought of the ballroom months earlier, of Margaret's cruel declaration that no man would ever choose her, and something fierce and determined rose within her chest. "I am ready," she said finally. "Let them know the truth." Neither of them could have predicted just how dramatically that decision would upend the fragile peace of the Whitfield household, nor how far Margaret would go once she understood that her schemes had failed to prevent the very outcome she had worked so desperately to avoid. The announcement came at a formal dinner hosted at Camden Estate, an event grand enough that word of it spread through the county within hours of the invitations being delivered. Alexander had arranged everything with careful precision, ensuring that the most influential families in the region, including the Whitfield household, would be present to witness what he intended to declare that evening. Eleanor stood before her small mirror that afternoon, dressed in a gown Alexander had quietly arranged to be delivered days earlier, a deep blue silk that fit her perfectly despite her modest frame, simple in its elegance rather than ostentatious. She barely recognized herself in the reflection, though the nervousness twisting through her stomach reminded her clearly enough of who she remained beneath the fine fabric. Margaret had been furious upon receiving the invitation, understanding immediately what it likely signified, though she had no choice but to attend, refusing the Duke's invitation being far more socially damaging than enduring whatever announcement awaited them that evening. Charlotte and Beatrice, sensing their mother's tension, had spent the days leading up to the dinner unusually quiet, aware that something significant was shifting beyond their understanding or control. The carriage ride to Camden Estate passed in tense silence, Margaret's expression carefully neutral though her hands remained clenched tightly in her lap the entire journey. Eleanor said nothing, focusing instead on steadying her own nerves, reminding herself of Alexander's steady presence, of the genuine connection they had built despite every obstacle placed before them. The grand dining hall at Camden Estate glittered with candlelight when they arrived, dozens of guests already mingling among tables set with fine china and polished silver, the air filled with the low hum of conversation and anticipation. Eleanor felt the weight of numerous curious glances as she entered alongside the Whitfield family, whispers rippling through the crowd as guests recognized the woman rumored to have captured the Duke's attention. Alexander found her almost immediately, crossing the room with a warmth in his expression that he made no attempt to hide despite the many watching eyes. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, offering his arm to escort her further into the gathering. "I feel as though every person in this room is waiting to judge me," Eleanor admitted honestly, though she accepted his arm gratefully. "Then let them judge," Alexander said. "By the end of this evening there will be no more room for doubt about my intentions or about the respect you deserve." Dinner proceeded with careful formality, Eleanor seated near Alexander at the head table despite Margaret's obvious discomfort at the arrangement, forced to watch from a lesser position alongside her daughters as the evening's true purpose slowly became apparent to the assembled guests. Conversation buzzed around them, filled with careful questions disguised as pleasantries, guests testing the boundaries of what exactly was happening between the Duke and this previously unknown young woman from a modest local family. It was only after the final course had been cleared that Alexander rose from his seat, tapping his glass gently to draw the attention of the entire hall. Silence spread quickly through the room as every guest turned toward him, curiosity and anticipation evident on every face. "I want to thank each of you for joining me this evening," Alexander began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet hall. "I know many of you have traveled some distance, and I know equally well that curiosity has played no small part in your willingness to accept this invitation." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd, though the tension underlying it remained palpable. "For those unfamiliar with recent county gossip," Alexander continued, "allow me to address it directly rather than permitting rumor and speculation to continue shaping the narrative. Over these past months, I have had the privilege of coming to know Miss Eleanor Whitfield, initially without revealing my own identity, a choice I made in the hope of discovering whether genuine connection could exist between two people unburdened by the weight of title and expectation." Eleanor felt every eye in the room shift toward her, her cheeks warming under the intense scrutiny, though she forced herself to sit tall, refusing to shrink beneath the attention the way years of habit urged her to do. "What I discovered," Alexander continued, "was a woman of remarkable character, intelligence, and resilience, qualities that have only grown more evident to me with each passing week of our acquaintance. I discovered someone who speaks honestly regardless of consequence, who extends kindness even to those who have shown her little in return, and who has endured circumstances that would have hardened a lesser person into bitterness, and yet has remained fundamentally good. Margaret's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she listened, understanding with growing horror where this declaration was heading. "I have heard troubling rumors circulating recently regarding Miss Whitfield's character," Alexander said, his voice hardening slightly. "Rumors I have since confirmed to be entirely without merit, spread deliberately by someone with clear motive to see our association ended. I will not name that person directly this evening, though I suspect many in this room can guess at their identity." A murmur spread through the gathered guests, several curious glances shifting toward Margaret, whose composure had begun visibly cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. "I say this not to embarrass anyone unnecessarily," Alexander continued, "but to make my position entirely clear. I intend to continue my association with Miss Whitfield openly and honestly, without concern for whatever rumors or schemes might be employed against her. She has endured enough unkindness in her life, without further interference from those who should have protected her instead." He turned then, extending his hand toward Alina, who rose from her seat, her heart pounding as she stepped to his side before the entire assembled gathering. "Months ago, at a ball not far from here," Alexander said, his eyes fixed on Alina rather than the watching crowd, "I witnessed Miss Whitfield's own stepmother declare, in front of an entire room of guests, that no man would ever choose her. I have thought of that declaration often in the months since, and I find myself standing here this evening with the distinct pleasure of proving that particular prediction entirely wrong." The room fell utterly silent, every guest holding their breath as they waited to see what would follow. "Alina," Alexander said, turning fully toward her now, his expression steady despite the vulnerability evident in his voice, "I have chosen you, not because of what you can offer my family's fortune or reputation, but because of who you are. I would like, with your permission, to formally court you with the full intention of one day asking for your hand in marriage, openly, honestly, and with the complete support of my family name behind you." Alina felt tears gathering in her eyes as the weight of his words settled over her, the culmination of months of quiet growth, painful revelation, and hard-won trust finally arriving at this moment before an entire room of witnesses. She thought of every cruel word Margaret had ever spoken, every moment of doubt she had carried about her own worth, and found them all dissolving beneath the sincerity in Alexander's expression. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I would welcome that, Alexander, with all my heart." The room erupted into a mixture of applause and startled whispers, guests turning to one another in astonishment at the dramatic turn the evening had taken. Margaret sat frozen at her table, her face a mask of barely concealed fury and humiliation, understanding with painful clarity that her schemes had not only failed, but had been publicly exposed before the very society she had spent years trying to impress. Charlotte and Beatrice exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to process a scene that upended everything their mother had promised them about their own prospects with the Duke. Several guests offered Margaret sympathetic but pointed glances, the kind that made clear her earlier gossip campaign had not gone entirely unnoticed by those paying close attention to the county's social currents. As the evening continued, guests approaching Alina with genuine warmth and congratulations, she found herself overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how she was perceived, transformed within a single evening from an overlooked stepdaughter into a woman whose worth had been publicly and unequivocally affirmed by one of the most powerful men in the country. But even as she accepted the congratulations of guests eager to align themselves with her newfound favor, Alina understood that the true test of everything Alexander had declared that evening still lay ahead. Public declarations were one thing, building a genuine life together, navigating his family's expectations, and finally confronting Margaret's cruelty directly rather than simply outmaneuvering it would require far more than a single dramatic evening of vindication. She glanced across the room toward her stepmother, who met her gaze with an expression of cold, simmering resentment that promised this was far from over. Whatever peace this evening had temporarily granted her, Alina understood that Margaret would not accept this defeat gracefully, and that the road ahead, however brightened by Alexander's public commitment, still held challenges neither of them could yet fully anticipate. The days following the dinner brought a flood of attention Alina had never before experienced. Invitations arrived at the Whitfield household, with a frequency that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. Families who had previously overlooked her entirely now eager to secure her presence at their gatherings, hoping to align themselves with her newfound connection to the Duke of Camden. Elinor found the sudden reversal both gratifying and deeply unsettling, understanding clearly that this new warmth had little to do with any genuine change in how these families valued her character, and everything to do with proximity to power. Margaret, for her part, retreated into a cold, watchful silence in the days immediately following the dinner, offering none of her usual sharp commentary, though Elinor recognized the calculation behind her stepmother's quiet, understanding that Margaret was far too proud and far too strategic to simply accept public humiliation without eventually seeking some form of retaliation. That retaliation arrived roughly 2 weeks later, delivered not through further rumor or gossip, but through a far more calculated approach that revealed the true depth of Margaret's determination. Elinor received a summons one morning to meet with Alexander's mother, the Dowager Duchess, at her private residence within Camden Estate, a meeting Alexander had mentioned might occur eventually, but had hoped to delay until Elinor felt more secure in her new position. The formal invitation left little room for refusal, and Elinor spent the morning of the meeting consumed by nervous anticipation, understanding that this conversation would likely determine much about how smoothly her path forward with Alexander might proceed. She arrived at the Dowager Duchess's private sitting room to find an elegant older woman with sharp, assessing eyes that reminded Elinor uncomfortably of Margaret's own calculating gaze, though tempered by a dignity that suggested decades of careful diplomatic training rather than simple cruelty. "Sit, child," the Dowager Duchess said, gesturing toward a chair positioned across from her own. "I have heard a great deal about you these past weeks, though I confess I prefer to form my own judgments rather than relying entirely on second-hand accounts." Elinor sat carefully, folding her hands in her lap, bracing herself for whatever interrogation might follow. "I understand your concern, Your Grace," she said. "I imagine my sudden appearance in your son's life has raised a great many questions." "More than a few," the Dowager Duchess agreed, studying Elinor with an intensity that made her want to shift uncomfortably in her seat, though she resisted the urge, maintaining the same steady composure she had learned to summon during years of Margaret's scrutiny. "Tell me, Miss Whitfield, what do you believe you can offer my son that the many carefully cultivated young women of appropriate standing cannot?" The question carried an edge of challenge, and Elinor understood immediately that this meeting would determine far more than simple pleasantries. She considered her answer carefully before speaking. "I cannot offer him fortune, connections, or the kind of strategic alliance that might strengthen his political standing," Elinor said honestly. "I understand that plainly, Your Grace, and I will not pretend otherwise to earn your favor. What I can offer him is honesty, unclouded by calculation or ambition. I have never sought his attention for what it might grant me, and I continue to value him for who he is rather than what his title represents." The Dowager Duchess studied her for a long moment, something shifting subtly in her expression, though whether toward approval or continued skepticism, Elinor could not entirely determine. "My son has spent his entire adult life surrounded by exactly the kind of calculated ambition you describe," the Dowager Duchess said finally. "Every young woman presented to him arrives with a mother eager to discuss dowries and alliances before any genuine conversation has even occurred. I have watched him grow increasingly weary of this pattern, increasingly guarded, increasingly convinced that genuine affection is simply not available to a man of his position." "I have noticed something similar in him," Elinor said quietly, "a carefulness as though he expects every kindness to carry a hidden cost. And yet he speaks of you," the Dowager Duchess continued, with a warmth I have not heard in his voice in many years. "He tells me you challenged him during your very first conversations, that you asked nothing of him beyond his honest company, that you treated him as an equal long before you understood the power he held over your circumstances." Elinor felt a small measure of hope stirring beneath her nervousness, though she remained cautious about assuming this conversation had already tilted in her favor. "I did not know his true position when our friendship began," she said. "I spoke to him as I would speak to any traveler passing through the county, without particular expectation or agenda. That, I suspect, is precisely why he values you as he does," the Dowager Duchess said, a faint smile finally softening her expression. "I will not pretend that your circumstances present no challenges, Miss Whitfield. Society will speak. Certain families will resent this match, believing their own daughters more deserving of my son's attention. You will face scrutiny that a woman born into higher station might be more prepared to navigate. I understand that, Elinor said. I have faced scrutiny and cruelty for much of my life already, Your Grace. I do not imagine society's judgment will prove entirely unfamiliar territory. The Dowager Duchess studied her a moment longer before nodding slowly, something like respect settling into her expression. Very well, she said. You have my provisional approval to continue this courtship, Miss Whitfield, though I will be watching closely to see whether the character my son describes matches the woman I observe over these coming months. Elinor left the meeting with a cautious sense of relief, understanding that she had cleared a significant hurdle, though the Dowager Duchess's careful wording made clear that full acceptance would require continued demonstration of her character rather than a single successful conversation. She returned to the Whitfield estate that afternoon to find an unexpected visitor waiting in the drawing room, a solicitor Elinor did not recognize, seated stiffly across from Margaret. An expression of grim satisfaction settled across her stepmother's face that immediately set Elinor's nerves on edge. Elinor, Margaret said, rising as she entered the room, her voice carrying an unfamiliar sweetness that Elinor recognized immediately as a warning sign rather than genuine warmth. How fortunate you have returned. Mr. Pemberton here has some important matters to discuss regarding your father's estate. Elinor's stomach tightened with immediate suspicion, understanding that whatever Margaret had arranged, it was unlikely to work in her favor. She sat carefully, watching as the solicitor opened a leather folder and began reviewing a series of documents with careful, deliberate precision. Miss Whitfield, the solicitor began, I have been asked to review certain provisions within your late father's will regarding your inheritance and guardianship arrangements. It appears there are some irregularities that require immediate attention. Elinor listened with growing alarm as the solicitor detailed a series of claims, suggesting that certain debts her father had left unresolved at the time of his death now legally fell upon Elinor's shoulders as his direct heir, debts that Margaret claimed she had generously covered for years out of familial obligation, debts that now, given Elinor's improved circumstances and pending engagement to a wealthy duke, should rightfully be repaid. This is absurd, Elinor said finally, unable to contain her frustration. My father left no significant debts. Whatever financial difficulties this household has faced were the result of Margaret's own spending, not obligations left by my father. I have documentation suggesting otherwise, the solicitor said carefully, sliding papers across the table for her inspection. Elinor examined the documents with growing dismay, recognizing immediately the careful manipulation at work, figures that seemed inflated beyond reason, signatures that appeared hastily arranged, the entire scheme clearly designed to extract significant sums from Elinor's new position rather than reflecting any genuine financial obligation. You forged these, Elinor said, looking directly at Margaret, her voice sharp with barely restrained anger. I did no such thing, Margaret said smoothly. I simply sought proper legal counsel to ensure this family receives what it is rightfully owed, now that you find yourself in a position to finally repay years of generosity, extended toward you despite having no true claim to this household's resources. Elinor understood immediately what Margaret intended, a calculated scheme to either extract significant financial concessions from her new relationship with Alexander, or failing that, to create a scandal significant enough to damage her reputation and potentially unravel the engagement altogether, painting her as either complicit in fraud or too naive to recognize when she was being manipulated. I will not sign anything, Elinor said firmly, rising from her seat. And I will be seeking my own legal counsel to review these claims thoroughly before any further discussion occurs. She left the drawing room with her heart pounding, understanding that Margaret's schemes had entered a far more dangerous phase than simple gossip and rumor. This was a direct legal and financial attack, one that could potentially create genuine complications for her relationship with Alexander regardless of its ultimate validity, simply through the scandal and uncertainty it introduced. She needed to speak with Alexander immediately, understanding that whatever battle Margaret had now chosen to wage would require far more than simple honesty to overcome. It would require careful strategy, legal expertise, and the full weight of Alexander's resources and reputation to counter effectively. and Alina found herself, for the first time since their public declaration, genuinely afraid of what her stepmother might be capable of when cornered and desperate to reclaim control over a situation that had slipped entirely beyond her grasp. Alexander listened without interruption as Alina explained everything that had transpired: the fraudulent documents, the fabricated debts, the solicitor Margaret had clearly hired to lend false legitimacy to her scheme. His expression darkened steadily as she spoke, though his voice remained calm and measured when he finally responded. "This ends now," he said simply. "I have resources at my disposal that your stepmother cannot begin to match: Alina, legal expertise, investigators who can quickly determine the authenticity of these documents, and enough influence to ensure that any attempt at fraud is exposed thoroughly and publicly if necessary." "I do not wish to destroy her," Alina said, surprising herself with the admission. "Whatever cruelty she has shown me, however calculated her schemes, I find I have no desire to see her ruined entirely. I only want this to stop." Alexander studied her for a long moment, something like admiration softening his expression despite the tension of the situation. "Your capacity for mercy continues to surprise me," he said. "Very well. We will handle this carefully, exposing the fraud clearly enough to end her schemes permanently, without necessarily seeking her complete destruction." Within days, Alexander's own solicitor, a sharp and thorough man named Edmund Caro, arrived at the Whitfield estate to review the documents Margaret had presented. His examination proved swift and decisive, quickly identifying inconsistencies in the signatures, discrepancies in dates that did not align with any actual transactions from Alina's father's lifetime, and clear evidence that the entire scheme had been fabricated within recent weeks rather than representing any genuine historical debt. Confronted with this evidence in a private meeting arranged at Camden Estate, Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely, her carefully maintained facade of righteous grievance collapsing under the weight of undeniable proof. "You cannot possibly understand what it has cost me," Margaret said, her voice raw with an emotion Alina had rarely heard from her stepmother, something closer to genuine desperation than calculated manipulation. "Raising 3 daughters alone, managing this household's finances, watching my own girl's prospects dim while Alina, who contributed nothing, now stands to become a duchess. Was I simply meant to accept this quietly?" "You were meant to treat me as a member of your family rather than a burden to be exploited," Alina said quietly, though there was less anger in her voice now than simple, tired sadness. "I never asked for special treatment, Margaret. I only ever wanted basic kindness, the same kindness you extended so easily to Charlotte and Beatrice." Margaret said nothing further, her expression a complicated mixture of shame and lingering resentment, unable to fully reconcile the collapse of her carefully constructed schemes with any genuine acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Alexander, watching this exchange with careful attention, finally spoke. "I am prepared to keep this matter private," he said, "rather than pursuing the legal consequences these fraudulent documents would normally warrant. However, this arrangement comes with conditions. You will cease any further attempts to interfere with my relationship with Alina, and you will refrain from any further public commentary regarding her character. Should you violate these conditions, I assure you, the full weight of legal consequence will follow swiftly." Margaret had little choice but to accept these terms, her options for continued resistance having been thoroughly exhausted by the exposure of her scheme. She left Camden Estate that afternoon in silence, the balance of power between her and her stepdaughter having shifted permanently and irrevocably. In the months that followed, life within the Whitfield household transformed gradually, though not without lingering tension. Margaret remained cold and distant, though she no longer actively schemed against Alina, understanding clearly that further attempts at manipulation would carry consequences she could not afford to face. Charlotte and Beatrice, freed from their mother's singular focus on securing the Duke's attention for one of them, began forming their own more genuine friendships with Alina, occasionally seeking her counsel on matters ranging from fashion to the complicated etiquette of society gatherings, a small but meaningful shift in a household that had spent years defined by hostility rather than connection. Alina's courtship with Alexander continued to deepen throughout this period, their bond strengthened rather than diminished by the trials they had already weathered together. She spent increasing amounts of time at Camden Estate, gradually earning the full approval of the Dowager Duchess through consistent demonstrations of the character Alexander had always insisted defined her, and slowly becoming a familiar and welcomed presence among the household staff and tenants who would eventually fall under her care as Duchess. The formal proposal, when it finally arrived, came not with grand public spectacle as their initial declaration had, but in the quiet privacy of the garden where their friendship had first taken root, among the same herbs Elena had been cutting the day Alexander first called upon her without warning. "I have thought of this garden often," Alexander said, kneeling before her among the rows of rosemary and thyme, "as the place where I first began to understand what genuine connection could feel like, unburdened by title or expectation. I can think of no more fitting place to ask you formally to become my wife." Elena felt tears gathering as she looked down at him, the culmination of everything they had endured together settling into this single, quiet, perfect moment. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The wedding that followed months later was held at Camden Estate, attended by nearly every prominent family in the county, a grand affair that stood in stark contrast to the small, quiet gatherings Elena had once endured as an overlooked stepdaughter serving refreshments rather than receiving them. She wore a gown of ivory silk, standing before the assembled guests not as the girl her stepmother had once declared unworthy of any man's choosing, but as a woman whose worth had been recognized, tested, and ultimately affirmed through months of genuine trial. Margaret attended, seated near the back of the grand hall, her expression unreadable as she watched her once dismissed stepdaughter exchange vows with one of the most powerful men in the country. Whatever bitterness she still carried, she said nothing to disrupt the ceremony, understanding perhaps, at last, the full and permanent consequences of having so thoroughly underestimated the young woman she had spent years trying to diminish. As Elena and Alexander exchanged their final vows, promising honesty, partnership, and genuine devotion to one another before their assembled families and community, Elena found herself thinking back to that humiliating evening months earlier, the shattered glass scattered across the ballroom floor, her stepmother's cruel declaration ringing through a room full of laughing guests. She thought of how far she had traveled since that moment, not simply in social standing, but in the quiet, steady confidence she had built in her own worth, a confidence that no longer depended on anyone else's validation, including the very Duke now placing a ring upon her finger. "No man will ever choose her," Margaret had declared with such casual cruelty, certain that her words carried the weight of unquestionable truth. Standing now in the grand hall of Camden Estate, surrounded by genuine warmth and celebration, Elena understood that her stepmother's prediction had been wrong in every possible way, not simply because a duke had chosen her, but because she had finally learned to choose herself first, refusing to let cruelty define her worth long enough for genuine love to find her exactly where she stood. A year into their marriage, Elena stood on the balcony overlooking the grounds of Camden Estate, watching the sun set over land that now, in every practical sense, belonged to her as much as it did to Alexander. Life as Duchess had brought challenges she had never anticipated during those quiet garden conversations that first drew her and Alexander together, responsibilities toward tenants, obligations within the highest circles of society, the constant balancing act of maintaining genuine kindness while navigating a world that often rewarded calculation over compassion. She had grown into the role gradually, drawing on the same quiet resilience that had carried her through years of mistreatment within Margaret's household, though now that resilience served a purpose far different from mere survival. She used her position to establish support for young women in the county who found themselves in circumstances similar to her own former situation, overlooked daughters and stepdaughters with limited resources and even more limited prospects, offering education, modest financial assistance, and the simple dignity of being seen and valued that she herself had once been denied for so long. Margaret's relationship with Elena remained complicated, though not entirely without progress. Charlotte had eventually married a respectable gentleman from a neighboring county, a match Elena had quietly assisted in arranging despite the complicated history between their families, an act of generosity that had visibly softened some of the lingering hostility Margaret still carried. Beatrice, too, had found her own path, pursuing an interest in painting that Elena had encouraged and financially supported, a small kindness that spoke to Elena's genuine desire to break the cycle of resentment that had defined so much of her own childhood within that household. Margaret herself never fully softened into warmth, her pride too deeply wounded by the events of that fateful year to allow genuine reconciliation. but she no longer actively worked against Alina's happiness, settling instead into a distant, careful civility that, while far from the affection Alina might have once hoped for from a parental figure, at least allowed for peaceful coexistence during the family gatherings that occasionally brought them together. Alexander, for his part, continued to find in Alina exactly what he had first glimpsed during those early weeks of anonymous friendship, a partner who challenged him honestly, who grounded him amid the constant pressures of his position, and who approached their shared responsibilities with a thoughtfulness that had earned her genuine respect throughout the county, not merely as the Duke's wife, but as a formidable and compassionate leader in her own right. Standing together on that balcony as the last light faded over the estate grounds, Alexander joined Alina, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the sky deepen into evening colors. "Do you ever think of that evening," he asked quietly, "when I first knelt beside you to gather broken glass?" "Often," Alina admitted, leaning into his embrace. "It feels impossible now, looking back, that a single moment of unexpected kindness could have led us here." "I do not think it was simply the kindness," Alexander said thoughtfully. "I think it was your response to it. So many people faced with cruelty either collapse beneath it or harden into bitterness that pushes away any genuine connection offered to them. You did neither. You remained yourself, honest and dignified, even when the world around you offered little reason to believe that honesty would ever be rewarded." Alina smiled softly, watching the first stars begin appearing across the darkening sky. "I suppose we both took a risk that evening," she said, "choosing to trust something neither of us fully understood yet. The best risks are often the ones we do not fully understand until we look back on them," Alexander said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. They remained on the balcony a while longer, comfortable in the quiet companionship that had defined their relationship from its very first honest conversation among the garden herbs, two people who had each learned, in their own difficult ways, that genuine worth could not be diminished by the cruel judgments of others, only revealed more clearly through the trials required to prove them wrong. Alina Whitfield, once dismissed so casually as a girl no man would ever choose, had become not simply a duchess, but a testament to the quiet, unshakable strength that patience, honesty, and genuine kindness could build, even against the harshest odds. And in the years that followed, whenever she encountered other young women facing similar cruelty and dismissal within their own circumstances, she made certain to remind them gently but firmly that the opinions of those who sought to diminish them held far less power over their futures than they might currently believe, and that sometimes the very qualities others mocked as weaknesses were in truth the foundations of an unshakable and quietly extraordinary strength.